Hi, I'm John Papola, and you're listening to the Emergent Order podcast. When my best friend and Emergent Order co-founder Josh and I first got to college, literally before we even unpacked our clothes, we set up our computers and went searching for an Ethernet patch cable so we could play games online. It was the first thing that we did. And we had a problem. We didn't have Ethernet cables. Ethernet has really connected our world and transformed all of human communication. And I'm very excited to share a conversation with the co-inventor of Ethernet, Bob Metcalfe. Bob's long career in technology spans essentially the entire digital revolution. All right. Bob, thanks for coming. I want to start off, you are a celebrity in my eyes, but I think for some people maybe they would say, who's Bob Metcalfe? So who is Bob Metcalfe today? What is your current position? You're at UT. Tell me about what you do right now.
I'm a professor of innovation at the University of Texas in the Cockrell School of Engineering, and my job is to help professors take their successful research and start companies.
So we had Jeff Sandifer on this past week talking about education and entrepreneurship. And teaching innovation. How do you do that?
I don't teach anymore. I tried teaching for a few years. I've been at it 8.5 years now. But after a few years, I decided enough other people were teaching that I could now mentor. And the difference is that I don't give lectures on how to start a company and how to raise money and so on. I meet with people and help them move their companies along, which is different.
You've had a pretty amazing career, and there's not many people who have fundamental computer science concepts named after them. So tell me, what is Metcalfe's law?
Well, Metcalfe's law states that the value of a network grows as the square of the number of users or attachments. And it began in the early 80s as a sales tool for my company because it encouraged people to grow their networks by buying more of our products. But in 1995, George Gilder, writing in Forbes magazine, decided to call it Metcalfe's law, and I've been going along with the gag.
Is it a law like Moore's law? Is it a rule of thumb that does it hold up as a concept?
Moore's law and Metcalfe's law. First of all, it's an enormous honor to be mentioned in the same sentence with Moore's law, but I say they're very similar in that they both begin with M. And Moore's law has been quantitatively accurate since 1965. Metcalfe's law, not so much. But we have begun fitting certain phenomena to this square law. So, for example, I wrote a paper a few years ago in IEEE Computer about fitting the first 10 years of Facebook to Metcalfe's law, and it does. It fits perfectly. And then a number of people, I would say 5 now, have written follow-on papers taking data and showing, it's roughly a square law. And then things got a little ugly recently. People have been using Metcalfe's law to justify the value of Bitcoin.
Interesting.
And my only worry about that is when Bitcoin goes down, I get blamed.
How did you first get into computer science? Because you mentioned that you had a company, and that company was 3M. Is that right?
3Com.
Or 3Com. It was 3Com. But let's go all the way back. How do you first get in? You were a CEO of a major corporation in the tech field, and you invented or co-invented one of the most fundamental technologies that allows the entire networked world to exist, Ethernet. How does this start?
My father was a test technician on Long Island in aerospace. He tested gyroscopes, so he never went to college, but he was sort of an engineer. And we built a train set in my basement in Bayshore, Long Island, with a big 4x8 piece of plywood. And from work, he brought home some toggle switches and some lights and some relays.
Were they the HO trains or the larger ones?
Lionel. They were Lionel trains, the big ones.
Yep.
And 8th grade rolled around, and my science teacher, Mr. Gosier, said it was time to do a project. He was into building things. So I decided to build a computer in 8th grade. It was kind of a simple computer, but it used the train set. It was the switches and the lights and the relay from the train set, only built into a box. And it would add any number between 1, 2, and 3 to any other number between 1, 2, and 3, and light up a light between 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So you'd turn on the switches and it would go click, 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 and it would produce the sum by lighting one of the lights. And what I remember most vividly was the grade I got on that project. A, triple plus, H, superior. So I think in that moment my future was set. And then I went to Columbia on Saturdays and got my first computer programming experience.
How old are you at this point?
Senior in high school. And then I went to MIT, and there was no computer science in 1964.
So what were you studying, like electrical engineering?
Right. So I eventually got a degree in electrical engineering from MIT, which was as close as you could get to computer science. And then went to Harvard Graduate School, which didn't have computer science either. There it was called applied mathematics. So I got a PhD in applied mathematics, which was really computer science at the time. And then I went to Xerox Research as a computer scientist for 8 years.
Now this is the famed Xerox PARC, isn't it?
It is, and arrived there in 1972 in Palo Alto.
So how does that happen? Like, did it immediately feel like you were in the future's laboratory when you get to Xerox PARC? Did you understand what Xerox PARC represented at that time, or was it just like another job?
It hadn't happened yet. It may have started in 69 or 70. I joined the computer science lab in 72. So it was brand new, and it wasn't the fabulous place it came to be known as later. But my PhD was in computer networking, the ARPANET, which became the internet, early version of the internet. And so I was in demand when I graduated. All the universities wanted the networking guy who could help them raise money from ARPA. So I got 9 job offers, one of which was from Xerox. And the one I wanted, by the way, was to be a professor at MIT, and I didn't get that offer. So instead, I had to take a job that paid twice as much, didn't have to raise any money, had no teaching obligations, and could do whatever the hell I wanted in Palo Alto. And I was a big Beach Boys fan, so I wanted to move to California anyway.
Did you learn to surf?
I knew how to surf, although the waves I'm used to are 3 feet tall, not 30 feet tall. But imagine my surprise when I arrived in Palo Alto to discover that the Pacific Ocean was an hour away and 45 degrees. So
here's this Long Island boy thinking, I'm moving to California.
Yeah, I'm going to put white stuff on my nose and get a suntan and surf. But none of that ever happened. Instead, we just did computer science.
So it's 72, you said, that you're at Xerox PARC. How long? And then you said you were there for how long?
8 years.
So what happens during those 8 years? Like what actually was your job? Like, who did you report to? Like, what was your daily life like?
I was in the computer science laboratory. My boss was named Jim Taylor, may he rest in peace, a graduate of the University of Texas, I might add. He was the boss of the computer science. He was the spiritual leader of the lab there. And I was the networking guy. So when I got there, I put Xerox on the internet. I just put MIT on the internet. Then as soon as I got to Palo Alto, I put Xerox on the internet, just repeated. I built the hardware and software for that. But then very quickly the lab decided to build arguably the first personal computers. And they needed somebody to network them together. And they looked around, and I was the guy who was the networking guy. So they said, network them together. And so in that, very lucky to get that job. I was the first person to ever have the problem of networking a building full of personal computers.
Now, I remember when I went to college I started school at Penn State in 1995. I actually started off in computer science. So before I switched into film and got into this creative stuff, I spent some time in comp sci. But the most important thing I remember is that we were so excited. Josh, my business partner now, Josh Myers, it was my roommate freshman year. My best friend since 5th grade. And we were so excited because there was a fast internet connection. Before we even unpacked our clothes, we took our PCs out and went hunting around for an Ethernet patch cable so we could play Doom, or maybe I think it was Doom, networked. What did it mean in early 1970s for you to be hooking up these computers to the internet? Like, what does that even mean? Like, there was no World Wide Web at this point.
Oh,
right?
no.
So
Well,
what was the quote internet at that point, and how were you quote networking it?
Between the time I entered MIT in '64 and you entered Penn State in '95, that was 30 years. So, and we have to think about that when we talk, because the words change and everything is different over that time. But in 1973, there were no personal computers. All the computers were as big as a room.
Yeah, giant IBM mainframes.
And the internet, which was then called the ARPANET, later became the internet, was networking together time-sharing machines with dumb terminals on them. To say PDP-10s, typically with 30 character a second typewriters. And the Xerox research in deciding to build the Alto personal computer, we called it the Alto, as in Palo Alto, that was a strange decision. A lot of people couldn't figure out why you would want to put a computer on every desk. Why would you want to do that? What a trouble. They make noise. The printer needs maintenance. The thing needs to be fixed. It takes up space. Why would you want to do that? So we decided we'd find out and built one.
What inside of Xerox, which is making copy machines, right? Xerox has become like a verb for making a copy. But what was Xerox's primary product lines in business at this time? It wasn't obviously selling personal
Xerox
computers.
was a hip and happening company. It was a monopoly. It sold copiers. It had huge profits. Therefore, it could afford a research center in Palo Alto. And the chairman at the time decided that this research center, in particular the computer science lab, should focus on the paperless office of the future, which is pretty ironic since Xerox made paper things. But the irony then fell back on itself, because one of the first things we built was the laser printer, which produced more paper than ever before. I mean, page per second, boom, 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 boom. So we produced lots of paper for Xerox.
So you're hooking up these computers to the ARPANET to do what?
Well, the initial killer app of the internet was called resource sharing. So the research principal investigators and their teams, sponsored by ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the Department of Defense, was the principal funder of computer science research in 1970s. And they decided they were buying all these PDP-10s, these interactive, the hot machine, the PDP-10 interactive time sharing system. They were buying one for everybody. So they figured that they would use resource sharing, make it possible to connect all their research campuses together on this big network so they could log into one another's machines. So they were doing research, developing applications that ran on the PDP-10, and then you'd be able to access them from anywhere in the world. And that was the goal, to share resources.
And so these resources, there is no graphical user interface yet.
No.
So it's not like Wikipedia or even like Word docs. So what am I getting? Am I getting just green text on a black screen of a readout? Is there such a thing as individual document files that can be read?
Well, the internet debuted in Washington, D.C. in 1972 as I was arriving at Xerox, and I got to edit the book, which you would call the Internet for Dummies, but we didn't call it that. We called it the Scenarios for Using the ARPA Computer Network, which I edited. And page after page was, if you would like to experiment with the simulated paranoid schizophrenic, there was a program that simulated a paranoid schizophrenic. You would log into this, you would say login to this certain PDP-10 out there, and then you'd run the program called PARY, P-A-R-Y, which was short for paranoid schizophrenic. And then you would type questions to it, and it would give you answers simulating a paranoid schizophrenic. But there was another app on the network that simulated a Rogerian therapist. So guess what we did? We connected them together so that the therapist would ask questions of the paranoid schizophrenic, who would then answer them, and they would go back and forth. And by the way, it only lasted like 5 or 10 exchanges before it became boring. But then there were programs that did weather simulation, and there were programs that did graphics. There were graphics, the beginnings of graphic programs. So you would use this book to, at the big debut at the Hilton there in '72, you'd go from site to site and try all the programs, which is sort of a showcase for the research projects of the ARPA scientists.
I think it's easy to forget that what you're doing whenever you connect to a website or anything is you are ultimately just downloading files from one other computer somewhere else in the world, right? Is that a fair way to... I mean, I know it's often multiple computers, whether one might be serving the ads and the other might be serving the graphics.
But here's something I think is cool, which is that the basic plumbing of the modern internet was invented in 1973 at Stanford. I was in the room. TCP/IP was being developed starting at Stanford in the summer of '73. And meanwhile, those of us at Xerox, we were building an internet at Xerox PARC, including protocols and Ethernet. And so they were happening at the same time in Palo Alto. It was all happening.
So what is TCP/IP? What is that? Like, what does it even stand for?
TCP is Transmission Control Program, and IP is Internet Protocol.
And what does it do?
These are agreements on what packets mean. So at the very bottom, the internet is based on packets. What Ethernet does, the plumbing of the internet, is carry packets around.
And what's a packet? I know I'm being very reductive, but
that's
a
fair question. It's important that you know. A packet has an address on the front of typically a computer program running across the country, and then a bunch of bits to be delivered to that program. So in software, you build this packet, and then you hand it over to the TCP/IP transport system, and it gets the packet over there. And then there's that's called a protocol. And then there's higher level protocols. Once the packet gets over there, you look inside of it, and you see, oh, this is a packet of type 29. And that means this is a website or something. So there are these protocols. TCP/IP, Ethernet are the plumbing down here. And a really interesting thing is they were invented in '73. The World Wide Web, which we all enjoy today, wasn't invented until 1989.
Wow, that's a long
time. And it wasn't
time.
Installed in numbers until 1994, when a company called Netscape went public. So just think how much time passed between when the plumbing got designed in the early 70s, and then the early 90s is when the web came along, and it just sat right down on top of that plumbing and worked just fine.
Is it a fair analogy to say at least parts of TCP/IP are like mailing addresses? Like, so your computer has an IP address? Is that part of that setup?
That's right.
That bit of data at the front of that packet is like a letter with a mailing address on it, and that mailing address is 192.168.0.4, and it sends it.
That's right. And that address is interpreted by these computers called routers, and they look at that address, and then they look in their routing tables to see where that address is, and then they send the packet in that direction. And then the next router looks at that number and moves it further and further until it finally arrives at its destination.
My understanding of the motivation for the creation of the ARPANET is that it was meant to be this decentralized way of keeping communications alive in the event of attack. Is that right? I can't really. I'm sort of jogging my memory. Is that maybe like a stylized summary looking back?
No, there's a whole. Success, as you well know, has many fathers. And so there's a million stories about the internet, many of which are not true. This one, there's a thread of truth about, because a guy named Paul Barron, may he rest in peace, wrote a 12-volume report for the RAND Corporation in the early 60s. And in that report, he designed he talked about packet switching, this core technology of the internet. And in that report, in a certain page, it's mentioned how this method of routing of packets from one router to the other would work even if this router got blown up. You would detect that and route around it through the other routers. And he may have actually written the sentence that the goal here was to have the network keep working despite thermonuclear war. But that wasn't the reason given. I've already mentioned resource sharing. Resource sharing was the reason given. So when ARPA went to build the ARPANET and begin the internet, they said it's for resource sharing. But Paul Barron, who invented the packet switching technology that the ARPANET adopted, mentioned in one paragraph of one 12-volume report that the network would be resilient. And it is resilient, but it wasn't built. Many of us working on it, we're not building it as a war machine. That wasn't the purpose. But there is this sentence that people hang on to.
So that resilience, in some respects, is a happy accident?
No, it's a feature. We talk about routing around. The internet routes around problems, and that's a crude reference to the underlying routing infrastructure of these routers that pass the packets around. But they use this expression more generally, like for censorship. There's going to be censorship. Well, don't worry about it. The internet will route around it. So it's a common reference to the resilience of the internet.
It's hard to even understand how what you were doing connecting these computers. If you invented Ethernet, what were you connecting before, and what was the Ethernet? What was Ethernet solving that you needed to solve? And it was you and David Boggs. Is that correct? Or like, who was the core team that was working on this problem?
Well, as you know, success has many fathers. So there's 100 answers to the question, who invented Ethernet? But I think Dave Boggs and I would be good candidates for that title. But anyway, Dave was a grad student at Stanford, and I recruited him, and he and I we were the Bobbsey twins for a few years building the first Ethernet. But there were two driving apps for the first Ethernet. One is we wanted all of these PCs to be on the internet, which meant we all had to get connected to this. In the computer room, there was a packet switch that was installed by ARPA. So if you wanted to be on the ARPANET, you had to connect to that packet switch. So one of the jobs that Ethernet had, the easy job actually, was to connect to that box. And it was easy because it was slow and no problem. The more challenging app is at the same time we were building the first laser printer. There were three of us. I built the operating system and the protocols, the Ethernet protocol. And Ethernet had to carry traffic. When you hit P, we invented P. Have you hit P to print things? In the old days, you'd use SneakerNet. It was called the principal competitor to Ethernet.
Carrying a disk over.
Yeah, you would carry a disk over and print it out.
Yeah.
But we invented P. So you just go P and it prints out over there. And so the Ethernet had to carry traffic from each of the PCs to the printer also. Now the printer was 500 dots per inch, page per second, 8.5 by 11. So if you multiply 8.5 times 11 times 500 times 500 times 1 per second, it's about 20 megabits per second. So the network had to be pretty zippy. So the first Ethernet, I'm fond of saying this, so let me add some drama here. The Ethernet was 10,000 times faster than the network on my desk the day before. 10,000, not 10 times. Not 1,000 times, 10,000 times faster. So in that moment, bandwidth became abundant, not scarce.
So, I mean, I wired my house with Cat7 Ethernet. I did it myself. I even crimped all the little plugs and everything. When I think, what is Ethernet? It's like, well, it's this cable, and it's got some protection around it, some plastic and some shielding, and then it's got this little plug that sort of looks like a phone plug, but it's got more pins. But that's not the special part, is it? It's the communicate. Is it a language? Like, how should I think about when you said you were writing the Ethernet protocol? What does that mean? Is it Computer language? What does that mean?
So, for example, I frequently tell people I invented Ethernet, but I had nothing to do with those cables that you were fussing with, because Ethernet's 46 years old, and the kinds of cables I dealt with were nothing like those. So Ethernet it became an international standard. It wasn't a standard initially for that cable. It was a list of protocols. In other words, we said there were going to be this big, thick it was a half-inch yellow cable, coaxial cable, that went down the middle of the hall. And the Ethernet protocol said that if you wanted to exchange packets with other machines connected to that cable, you had to run a cable up to the yellow thing and tap into the yellow thing. So we we built and specified a cable and a tap. And then we said if you wanted to send a packet, there's rules about how you send a packet. For example, listen to the cable and see if there's somebody already sending a packet, in which case you wait. And if there's nobody sending one, you can start anytime you want, but then you have to listen while you're sending to see if anyone interferes with you. And if someone does interfere with you, you must stop immediately and choose a random number. You've just discovered that you want to send a packet and there's somebody else interfering with you. Of course, they've discovered it too. You both discovered the interference. So you both choose a random number, count that random number down to 0, and try again. So what's the purpose of the random number? It's to keep the two of us from colliding over and over again. See, that guy chooses one random number, I choose another one, and thereby one of us is going to go first and the other one is very unlikely to go at the same time. So that was the method of sharing the cable, randomized retransmission. So that's part of the rule book. The Ethernet protocol is you must take turns, and here's how you take turns. And then there was the actual encoding of the packet, which is voltages on a cable. How do you say 1? How do you say 0? And the first 8 bits are the address. Okay, the first 8 bits are the address of the machine that you're sending to. So every machine looks at every packet as it's whizzing by on the cable. When it sees its address, it copies that packet into memory and processes it with software.
Wow. So what was there one part of that was the big leap? Was it that random negotiation that gave you the leap in performance over what was possible with the other ways it was being done before?
The generalized notion of randomized retransmission we borrowed from a preceding network called the Aloha Packet Network, the Aloha Radio Network, and it did randomized retransmissions. We borrowed that idea and then we perfected it. So there is a patent. There's 4 patents. But the big one describes that taking turns thing. But there's the general notion of the shared cable and how you're going to share the cable and what the packets are going to look like. So there is an Ethernet patent that we filed and it issued, and it's expired now.
So you do this, you've suddenly got 10,000 times the bandwidth, more than even presumably the apps at Xerox PARC could make use of. What happens next? Is it immediately recognize that this was a major breakthrough? How does it?
Well, we had to build it, invent it, and then build it. And by the way, that was troublesome because there was a guy in the Xerox lab, there were 2 guys actually, who didn't like me. And it was mutual. And so they didn't think Ethernet was a good idea. So I had to go up against them. And one of them was more powerful than me. And he was going to build his own network called XNet. And of course he would win because he was much more powerful than me, senior to me. But I convinced Bob Taylor, my boss, to get this other guy who I will not name to desist. So there was a little battle there. And then the Ethernet card that David Boggs and I built became one of those options that so these Altos, these personal computers, we were building them in the lab there.
Yeah.
As a computer scientist, you could say you wanted one, and we'd give it to you. It cost something like $30,000, but we'd give it to you. And the funny money, the $30K, came from research dollars. And one of the options was to get the Ethernet card so that your machine could be on the network, and it was an option. So there was another fight there. So people were saying, I don't need this network thing. I have SneakerNet. I don't need to pay it cost something like
I can walk this floppy disk down really faster than that.
So there was a period where Ethernet was an option. This is one of the things that David Boggs was fond of saying. He would say, Ethernet is not an option, meaning we learned pretty quickly that it was mandatory. So after a few months of this option nonsense, it finally no longer was an option. It was included in every Alto that went out. But then we filled Xerox with Altos, and every Alto was on an Ethernet, and every Ethernet was connected to the laser printer and to a router to connect Rochester, New York, to Palo Alto, to Dallas, Texas. They all got connected.
And was Ethernet starting to get used on these long distances?
No.
Okay, so what was connecting the machines over these longer distances?
Well, there was a higher level protocol. It wasn't TCP/IP yet, but it was like TCP/IP, which tied these Ethernets together. So these Ethernets were scattered around, and there were telephone lines connecting them. And it was the higher level Internet protocol. It had a different name, but it was very simple. TCP/IP would allow you to send the packets around your Ethernet, and then some of them would leave your Ethernet and go cross-country to the other Ethernet. And you could print on the printer over there, not just the one in your building, or you could send email to the computer there. And so we filled Xerox with an Internet. And then in 1979, I left Xerox to start a company, 3Com Corporation. And around the time that the Internet was moving forward, accelerating, and we decided to build the plumbing of the Internet and sell it, 3Com Corporation. And then a big fight started about whether Ethernet was going to be a standard or not. And there were a lot of non-standard networks that were similar to Ethernet, copies, if you will. And then we decided that Ethernet would be a worldwide standard. So we created a standards body, IEEE Project 802, and we submitted the specs, the updated specs for Ethernet to the standards body.
What is IEEE?
The Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. It's a huge membership, and it makes standards.
And is it a governmental body or is it a private?
No, it's a professional organization.
Okay, so it's a private enterprise.
It's private. And we chose it because it had a great record of making standards, useful standards in the computer space. It still makes Wi-Fi is a IEEE standard. And
to diverge a little bit into the politics of technology, there is this sense. Al Gore said, the idea that Al Gore invented the internet or something like that. But the bigger thing is that because ARPA was a government agency, that essentially that government funding is the primary source for all this technology that we have that sits on top of the internet. And how do you think about that when you look at all the different organizations and what was the government's contribution and these early research, these research funds contribution? It seems pretty important. It seems pretty fundamental.
In the last few sentences, you've said a few infuriating false things. The biggest one of which is that Al Gore invented the internet. I'm here to say that Al Gore did not invent the internet. He invented global warming. The Gore Law, there was a bill that was helpful to the internet, and it was signed into law by George Bush in it was called the Gore Bill, in 1991. The internet was operated, this is the 50th year of the internet, right this year. So on October 29th of 1969, the internet began working, began carrying packets. So it was carrying packets in 69, and Al Gore invented it in 1991, just for the record. Opportunistic politician that he is. But the ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the Department of Defense, as I mentioned earlier, was the principal funder of computer science research then, and maybe even still today, I'm not sure. And so the ARPANET was a initiative of ARPA, and so you cannot deny the role of government, the Department of Defense in particular, in starting the internet. But to say that most of it came from the internet, came from ARPA, would not really be true, because ARPA's budget was those days some small number of tens of millions of dollars, but billions got invested to build the internet, like my own company, for example.
And this IEEE, so you've got these organizations, because I think a lot of times when people think of standards, they think, well, that's what government agencies do, is they sort of lay down the law on standards. But IEEE is a private enterprise.
Although at the IEEE meetings that I attended, starting in 1980, the National Bureau of Standards attended those meetings and was helpful. So no denying they were helpful. But the ultimate standards maker in that case was the IEEE, who later, as I mentioned, standardized Wi-Fi many years later, 20 or 30 years later. So there were the standards bodies, and then and the Internet Engineering Task Force actually did most of the internet standards. So Ethernet, there's different ways of getting. So TCP/IP was not an IEEE standard; it was a Internet Engineering Task Force standard.
And what is that organization?
It's a private organization, also formed by basically the professors and grad students who built and companies that built the internet. So that's where that was organized. And ARPA supported it, but many of its members, were private members. So the internet got built by startups in Silicon Valley whose professors had been sponsored by ARPA.
So you start this company, 3Com. How did you do that? What was that? Did you have a customer that you had in mind, or was there like a indication that there was companies that are going to buy this? I mean, it's easy to imagine looking back. Well, obviously this is going to be the biggest thing in the whole world. But how did that process happen? Of going, you hadn't been an entrepreneur before that, right? This is your first entrepreneurial.
That's right. So
venture.
Keep in mind that a lot of people were involved in developing the internet, and they all have their own slice on how it happened. But in my case, I left Xerox in January of '79 and became a consultant to the world's second largest computer company called DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation.
Oh, yeah. I remember the DEC Alpha chip.
And the PDP-10 was a DEC, my favorite computer. But Gordon Bell was the vice president of research of DEC, and he admired Ethernet, which had been published as a paper by Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. So he invited me as a consultant to do an Ethernet for DEC. And I said, I really can't do that because I feel loyal to Xerox, and plus I've already designed the best Ethernet I know how, and yours wouldn't be as good. So we had the idea of inviting Xerox and DEC to work together to make Ethernet a standard. And then we got Intel to join us. It was DEC, Intel, and Xerox. And DEC, Intel, and Xerox I helped them, created this IEEE standards body, and then sent a spec over to that committee, said, please make this a standard. IBM and General Motors got annoyed, and they invaded IEEE 802 and proposed their own competing standards. So then we had a huge fight that lasted for, 20 years, but 2 or 3 years intensively. And the IEEE in the end made 3 standards: Ethernet, IBM Token Ring, and General Motors Token Bus. Those were 3 alternative networks that did roughly the same thing. Ethernet was the best. Ethernet eventually won because you've never heard of those other 2.
I vaguely remember IBM Token Ring.
Well, it took us a long time to kill it, but we finally did. So as soon as I was confident that DEC, Intel, and Xerox were going to pursue Ethernet as an open standard, and that would be in the spring of '79, I founded 3Com on June 4th, 1979, because I felt I could provide them with products.
Right.
Me and my team had built Ethernet before. We could do it again. And in fact, we shipped the first TCP/IP. The first commercial version of the Internet's basic protocols, my company shipped as we sold it as software. We sold Ethernet cards to people, and we started building the infrastructure of the Internet.
So you have this technology that you've developed. you have an idea of prospective clients. Did you get commitments from either of these companies that they would buy your products if you started your company? How did you get the capital to get started? Like, you're starting this thing and you don't have any income yet because you don't have a product yet to sell.
Well, I was a consultant. So the initial revenue, the company was founded with $27,000 that I won in a lawsuit against a real estate agent in San Francisco. And I got a check for $27,000 net of legal fees, which were more. And that was my net worth. Put it in the bank, and then I started 3Com with that money. But I was a consultant. So for the first year or two, we paid our salaries with consulting fees from DEC, from Exxon, from Texas Instruments, from others, all of whom were interested in this internet thing.
And so what are you using that capital to do? Like, how are you building a company? It's you and who else, and what are you building? What are you building that you're going to sell?
We found a customer. The company was called Exxon, who had an initiative in Silicon Valley called Exxon Office Systems. And we found one of those companies, I've even forgotten its name, but Exxon was the parent company. And they listed 4 products, Ethernet products: an Ethernet 10 megabit per second transceiver, an Ethernet board for the VAX mini computer, an Ethernet board for the PDP-11 mini computer, and the TCP/IP software that was being standardized by the Department of Defense. And they wanted those 4 products, and I agreed to deliver them to them for $750,000, after which I gave them a worldwide, non-exclusive, perpetual license to do whatever they wanted with those products. But I retained ownership of the products. So we delivered those 4 products to the world's largest company. And then we turned around to the venture capital community and said, and this is much like what Bill Gates did. Having sold one big customer, we then turned to the VC community and said, we'd like to bring these 4 products to market. And we raised venture capital.
Where were they deploying them in, and were they manufacturing them? A 10 megabit Ethernet card, is that what you said?
Yeah.
So it's like a little card that goes into a little slot in one of these little computers.
Yeah, stop using the word little.
Well, they were probably giant at the time, weren't they?
They were this big.
Yeah, they were big.
Like a foot long.
They were a full-sized card.
Yeah.
I'm thinking because maybe like 40 gigabit Ethernet would still be tiny today.
But they got smaller later.
They got smaller. So did you manufacture them? Did you hire people to physically solder and make these things? And how did it work?
When we raised the venture capital, we had already prototyped these 4 products so we could deliver them to Exxon. So we then began to prepare to launch them as products.
So you had the prototypes, and you were like, okay, so now we need money to take this prototype that we've hand built, or how did you?
Well, no, they were
roughly, or
we had technicians, we had engineers, we knew how to build things, so we built them.
Yeah,
and we sent a set of them over to Exxon, who then built a network. Barry, our customer, built his network over there at Exxon, and then we started building. Thinking about launching these and building them, and then we launched them. We launched TCP/IP. TCP/IP was the first product we launched, and it would run on your Unix machine. There were no Unix machines. There were a few. So if you had a Unix machine, we could network it with TCP/IP, but there was hardly anything to connect to. You understand?
Right.
But there were some, and then our second product was a 10 megabit per second Ethernet transceiver. It plugged into that big shared cable and allowed you to send packets back and forth. And then we made these 2 cards, one for the VAX mini computer and one for the PDP-11 mini computer, that you could plug in and put them on that internet. So you could build an internet of Unix machines with our products. Was this
part of what led Unix as an operating system? So for people that don't know what Unix is, it was like maybe the original open source operating system?
Well, it was it's called Linux now. But so Linux was a copy of Unix, and Linux is open source. Unix was not initially open source.
But was it initially by one company, or was there a standard of Unix that? Because were there different Unixes?
Unix was owned by AT&T.
Oh, it was AT&T.
It was developed at AT&T.
Right, I forgot about
so
that.
we had to license Unix from AT&T, and then we sold a networking product, and we sold it to AT&T.
So where does the PC? So you've got these big customers buying this new technology for this
big Unix mini computers.
For these big computers in this very narrow set of uses at this point. And I know I owned many 3Com Ethernet cards among other products over the years. What is the thing that then take us forward now to when this starts to become something that we're 3Com and where your creations are impacting not just sort of mainframes, but like everyday people?
Happened in two steps. So we began by selling these 4 products to the mini computers, of which, so we would sell 10 a month of these babies. And there were 10 of us selling 10 a month. And then we got a customer called Sun Microsystems, who made, friends of ours, who made computer workstations. And we got the business of building a card for the Sun workstation, which we did. And we became the supplier of Ethernet to Sun workstations. So then we started shipping hundreds per month at $1,000 each, I might add, to Sun. And so we became the Internet supplier for Sun. Meanwhile, we knew, because we had worked at Xerox, that there were going to be personal computers someday.
Right.
And that it was our job to have Ethernet for those personal computers when they came. So we started trying to figure out how to get Ethernet to shrink from this big to this big.
And this big, Bob is making the size of a basketball down to the size of maybe a softball.
Right. So we started working on a chip with a partner. And IBM announced the IBM personal computer in August of 1981.
Right. Were you at Xerox PARC when Steve Jobs had his famed visit and saw the Ethernet network and the GUI and all this stuff and had his like...
I left in early 79, and I believe his visit was in late 79. By the way, in June of 79, I had just incorporated 3Com, and I was sitting in my apartment then. I had 2 apartments, one in Palo Alto, one in Boston. And I was sitting all by myself in my apartment in Boston, feeling sorry for myself. And the phone rang, and it was a guy named Steve from a computer company in Cupertino called Apple. I had never heard of Steve. I had never heard of Apple. I hadn't even heard of Cupertino after living in the Bay Area for 10 years. And he invited me down, and he had heard I was a networking expert, and he started talking to me like I might want to join Apple and be his networking guy. But I explained I had just incorporated my new company. So he became my friend and supporter, and he didn't get angry with me. He helped me build 3Com, so I'm forever grateful to him. But so we're working on this chip, and IBM announces the PC. So we build a card, an option card, right, with that chip in it so that it would fit inside of an IBM PC. And then we shipped it a year after IBM shipped the PC. And we took off like a rocket ship. Everybody wanted this. Eventually, we were shipping millions per month of these cards, multi-billion-dollar company. But it was so we shipped the Etherlink, it was called. The Etherlink, you plugged it into an IBM PC and put it on a network. Sold for under $1,000. I think it may have been initially $750. And we started selling a lot of them, and we went public in March of '84 based on sales of Etherlinks.
And then were you providing Ethernet products for Apple as well, or did they build their own?
When Steve and I met, and I explained I was doing my company, he hired Bob Belleville, who had worked at Xerox with me, to build the Macintosh. And Steve found the Ethernet that we were peddling to be too expensive for his machine. So he had Bob Belleville build a cheapy Ethernet called AppleTalk.
Ah, right.
And so AppleTalk, for the longest time, was the only way you could network And we even built an Ethernet for the early Apple II, Apple IIIs, but no one wanted them because Apple talk. So I didn't get Steve to put Ethernet in his products until he did Next. So the Ethernet was in the Next, and then it went into the Mac later. And now it's leaving. Yeah. Now it's Wi-Fi. But
I have the zealotry of a convert to all things Apple because I grew up building PCs myself, and so I was intimately familiar with putting those PCI or ISA card slots in my PCs, but I remember Steve Jobs, a video interview of Steve Jobs explaining how when he first visited Xerox, he saw all these technologies, and one of them was Ethernet networking, but the GUI, the graphical user interface, captivated him, and it wasn't until Next where he came to appreciate the two others, which were Ethernet networking and object-oriented programming.
Yep.
So this is big stuff. This is the centerpiece of everything we use. What did you learn now, just at that point, about innovation and entrepreneurship?
Well, for surely you've run into the question, why is Silicon Valley so cool or so innovative? Or what is it about Silicon Valley? 3Com is an epitome, whatever the word is, of the Silicon Valley startup. So we did everything you're supposed to do right down Main Street. We raised venture capital. We recruited people from HP. We partnered with Apple. We just did everything, and it worked beautifully. We had competitors. For example, a famous competitor. If I were a better person, there wouldn't be a Cisco. Cisco was founded the year we went public. We made routers before they existed, and they blew past us. So now you'd call that $100 billion mistake. But we did this fiercely competitive, innovative Silicon Valley thing right up the middle, right? Just a classic case.
But what is innovation? Because one of the things I feel like is often either misunderstood. I don't know whether this is a misunderstanding or a question of the way we use words, but there's this notion of invention, like Bob Metcalfe invented or co-invented Ethernet. But then there's this other word, innovation, which is not the same word as invention, but it's related.
Well, I wrote a paper about this.
So how should I think about the difference between invention and innovation?
Well, you need to read my paper, the title of which is Invention is a Flower, Innovation is a Weed. So when you are inventing, everybody loves you. You are a genius. You're building new cool things. Ooh, ah. But then you take your invention and you bring it to the world. And what you find out is that the world does not want to be innovated upon. There's a thing called the status quo. And the status quo has resources, and it can be mean and nasty. And you, as an innovator, are a weed, and they're trying to kill you. In my case, there were, without exaggeration, 20 different networking schemes that competed with Ethernet. The IBM Corporation had its own token ring. It was trying to kill us.
Right.
The
biggest computer company in the world at that point.
They had 95% market share. They had decided their token ring was going to be how computers were connected. And they lied and cheated. They did everything you could imagine. And every day for 10 years, I'd go to work, and my board of directors and my employees and my wife told me that IBM was going to kill us soon. And I kept going. And eventually all those people were proved wrong, and I was proved right. Can you imagine how obnoxious I am now? Having ignored advice for 10 years. Do you think I take advice anymore? No, I know better. So we killed them. It was fierce competition. It was exactly what the free enterprise is all about. It happened right there. This fierce competition.
I'm obviously, for anyone who knows me or listens to this or knows about our company, I'm a booster for capitalism. I believe it's the greatest social invention, the greatest technology, if you will, that humanity has ever invented. And if you can even say that it is an invention, because I think it's fundamentally human, right? What were you doing? You were trying to solve a problem and seeing an opportunity to apply that solution to other people's problems. And to succeed, you had to actually solve their problem for them. And a buddy of mine said, that capitalism is the most moral system we've ever seen because it is the only one where you have to give before you can receive. And your story is a perfect example of that, right? You get this small amount of money, although it was obviously a lot bigger at the time. $27,000 in 1979 is a lot more than 27 grand today. And you put it all on the line, and you don't have customers. You have you've got some companies paying you some consulting fees, but there's no reason to believe that this is going to succeed other than just your hope and your vision for this potential. And that's like the heart of the enterprise, isn't it?
So I am, in addition to being professor of innovation at the University of Texas, I am the Murchison Fellow of Free Enterprise at the University of Texas. And I've given this topic a lot of thought, and I have an emotional response to capitalism and free enterprise that's perfectly aligned with the one you just expressed. But then I also have a detailed technical feeling about it. So I knew that Silicon Valley existed when I arrived. It was growing, and it had rules and procedures and guarantees and protections, and so I just fit into that machine, the Silicon Valley machine, and when I decided to start my own company, I did it because everybody else was. It's what everyone did. Didn't everybody start a company? And there were rules about you could raise money and you could sell products and you could sign contracts and the corporation itself is a technology. The invention of the technology and all the kinds of corporations there are and all the rules associated with how they should operate, that is economic technology there. So you have to learn how to operate a corporation as a technology. I remember I incorporated as a California corporation. That was a mistake. But in the A round, my venture capital A round, there were a few extra pages that moved me to a Delaware C corporation. Bam, done. Because the rules in Delaware were better, more conducive for venture capital than the rules in California.
And I understand the other big thing about Delaware is kind of a feedback loop that the actual judges in Delaware have a lot more experience with corporate law because it's become this hub, and so it's just generally kind of a better place to get savvy, seasoned judges.
Oddly, the Delaware C Corporation is part of the Silicon Valley technology. In other words, when you're a Silicon Valley company, time to have venture capital, you're a Delaware C Corporation. That's just a feature of the corporation technology in Silicon Valley. I guess I'm responding to your question by saying it was reassuring to have Silicon Valley right in front of me operating. And there were success stories, role models, people who had succeeded. There were things you were supposed to do. There was the Western Association of Venture Capitalists existed. They had a directory so you could call people up and raise money. And HP was down the street, and it was normal to go just recruit people from there. They were like a grad school in Palo Alto.
The only thing you didn't do was drop out of Stanford. You actually had a PhD.
And I was a professor at Stanford. Most of the researchers at Xerox Research were also professors at Stanford. I remember we recruited adult supervision. Another one of the technologies of Silicon Valley goes under the rubric adult supervision. So I got my adult supervision when I raised A round, and then went out and recruited Bill Krause to be my adult supervision. Bill became CEO of the company. He joined the company when we had 12 employees, and we kicked him upstairs to chairman when the company had 12,000 employees. So you could conclude from that Bill succeeded as our adult supervision. A lot of people think Steve Jobs was the CEO of Apple.
Right.
He founded Apple in 1976. He became CEO in 1996. So for 20 years, Steve was learning how to be his own adult supervision. But he had, from day one, he had Mike Markkula and Scotty and John Scully and a bunch of other people as his adult. So that's another structure of the Silicon Valley innovation machine, is the idea that you should have adult supervision in your startup.
Yeah, like Larry Page and Sergey Brin bring in Eric Schmidt to be CEO of Google.
At Cisco, John Morgridge, the two founders brought in John Morgridge and then immediately were ejected from the company, the two founders. So I was just using that as another example of part of the rule structure that makes it, you get it. Oh, adult supervision, of course.
Now, underneath that, why? What's this adult supervision? Why can't you have a bunch of radical young guys who are the ones that invented it all in the first place run the show?
Because running a successful, high-growth, high-performance company that's going to grow into the billions of dollars is not simple. It's just as hard to be. It's much harder to be VP of sales than to be an engineer at a company. Selling is complicated, and all of it's complicated. So my favorite metaphor is the gear shifting metaphor. A company is like a car with a gear, and each person. You have to look at each person in their job, and the company is growing faster than they are. So at some point, some of them redline, and it's time to shift, which means replace them. And some people grow forever with the company and always succeed. And the people in the company, when it's 10 people, are different from the people in the company when it's 100 people or 1,000 people or 10,000 people. Different skills emerge as being necessary, and it's very complicated. So you need adult supervision to operate a high-performing, high-growth, scaling Silicon Valley company.
I heard Patrick Byrne, the CEO of Overstock, explain that as your company grows, you go from like working in the business to working on the business, meaning you might be inventing. Like if it's a website business, you might be the one that at first like builds the website, but then you start to have to think about how to build the company, and then you start have to think about how to design the systems that allow the company to be what it is in a world where, you want it to grow and you can no longer rely on, well, I know Bob is there and Bob's great and he's going to make sure it's all running. It's like, well, there's 10,000 people below Bob. So how do you make sure that everyone's a mini Bob, or if they're not a mini Bob, they're whatever they need to be. And if they decide to quit, you're going to get somebody else who's able to do a similar thing, and it doesn't turn the whole place upside down. Like, so what did you learn about that kind of systems building, being part of this unbelievable company that you founded?
Well, we reorganized the company every year or two because it was rapid. 3Com was a very rapidly growing company. We were at least tripling every year. So it was chaos reigned. So you had to pay attention to who was doing what, because some people, their jobs outgrew them, and sometimes they didn't. Some people went from individual contributors to managers, and some didn't. And then some went to managers of managers, and some didn't. And in sales, we started selling direct, and then we started selling through manufacturers' reps, and then we started selling through value-added distributors, and then we started selling through distributors. We ended up going through two-step distribution, whatever that means. So each of those modes of sales had different sales compensation, different territory management, different activity management, different contracts, and then we had international distributors, one in each of the countries. How do you do that? There are people who know how to do that, so you want them in your company. You hope that the people in your company can just keep growing forever, but a lot of times you just have to bring in new people. I went from CEO of my company. When Bill Krause joined, I became VP of Sales and Marketing for 2 years.
Was that a great time or was that hell? You're an engineer, you're a PhD, you're a professor.
Well, the first week of it was hell because my board of directors informed me that I was no longer the CEO. But we would like you to be head of sales and marketing. Okay. So that first week was kind of tough.
You had the extra co-founder on the business card, which was probably still helpful.
I have a rule. I don't put the word founder on business cards because founder's not a job. And that's why I advise people starting, please don't put founder on your business card. Just put what you do on your business card, and being founder isn't what you do. In any case, I was chairman of the board and VP of sales and marketing and principal shareholder. But I had to learn how to sell. So I took us from $0 to $1 million a month, and we went public on that basis. But then sales got too complicated. So Mike Halaburka became our new head of sales. We recruited him from HP. And he took us from $1 million a month to $5 million a month. He was fabulously successful. And then he redlined. So we had to let him go and bring on Chuck Kempton, who took us from $5 million to $25 million. And then he redlined. And then we got Bob Finocchio to take over, and he took us into the billions. So we were gear shifting through salespeople, boom, boom. Every one of those people succeeded, but all of them got fired. In my case, there were a couple of cases. Mike and I both stayed with the company after we were relieved of our duties as head of sales. But Chuck stormed out the door. He was pissed because he didn't agree with our assessment that he had redlined. And, that just happens.
So I'm going to put on my Marxist hat and say, it sounds like you're describing an exploitative system that cares only about growth from a human's perspective. You got these people and they're doing great, but but off they go the second they can't deliver. So make a humanistic case for me why this is a good thing to do or why it's necessary. Or if I'm somebody who hears about the growth inside of an enterprise and thinks this sounds kind of heartless, what's your response to that?
Well, I just heard John Mackey talk about conscious capitalism, and the point he makes, which I understood years ago, is that you have multiple constituencies. So you have your employees, you have your suppliers, you have your customers, you have your investors, and it's your job to serve them all. And sometimes serving them all leads to conflict. That is, your customers want you to perform well, but one of your employees is not performing well enough in their current job. So in order to serve the customer better, this person must get fired or reassigned, not necessarily fired, but at least reassigned or receive some training or something. But sometimes you just have to fire them. I'm sorry, because you have other people that you're watching out for. So investors are people and customers are people. So it's people versus people. It isn't people versus profits or anything like that. So the reason that you heartlessly let go your head of sales is the rest of the constituencies need success in sales, and that guy's not delivering. In your judgment, that's a management judgment. In your judgment, that person needs to be reassigned because you're not firing on all cylinders. So the way I twist the answer here is it isn't people versus money or profits, this sort of Marxist lens that you were looking at it through. It's people versus people, and to serve these people, you must rearrange these people, and it's the way innovation happens. Economists will tell you innovation is what leads to freedom and prosperity.
Yeah, I had a long conversation with Deirdre McCloskey, who believes that capitalism. I mean, I think anybody that knows the history of the term capitalism and likes free enterprise doesn't necessarily like the term capitalism because it was essentially like a kind of Marxist, Marxist term. And so she says, what we really have is ideaism. It's a system that's all about bringing ideas into fruition, like your company. I mean, it wasn't really about capital so much as it was about the idea. You didn't come to the table with millions of dollars. You had a relatively small amount of money, but you had an idea that worked.
You could call it economic freedom if you want.
Right. You had the freedom to start. Nobody had to give you permission to try to start 3Com.
I had freedom to recruit Mike to be our head of sales, and I had the freedom to fire him when he ran out of runway, and I had freedom to do a contract with Exxon to deliver products for them, which we did, and it was a binding. Contracts are an important part of this, the fact that you can have contracts.
How long did you come back to being CEO after being asked to release the reins and move into the sales role?
10 years later, I was running the hardware division of 3Com, which was the profitable division, the big division, and Eric was running software, and Bob was running sales, and it was time to replace Bill as CEO and have him move up to chairman. So the board had a bake-off, and Eric was chosen to be CEO, and that was the occasion upon which I retired at the end of 1998.
Were you put that in air quotes? Were you not happy about that, or were you ready to move on at that point?
Well, I wasn't happy at the decision. I wanted to be CEO again. But, this board of directors, I recruited this board of directors, and I gave them one job: choose the CEO. So they did. So what am I going to do? Complain? I was sad for a week and then retired. But I didn't really retire. I just moved on to a next job.
So what did you do next?
I became a journalist for 10 years.
That's an interesting change. What prompted that?
The owner of InfoWorld, who owned 300 magazines, Pat McGovern, called me up one day and said, "You know everybody in Silicon Valley. Why don't you come be publisher of this magazine, and you can sell them ads?" And I then spent, I think I spent 9 years there learning how to sell ads. I had bought ads at 3Com. So I had been VP of corporate marketing. Oh, I failed to mention, I later became VP of corporate marketing. That was my last job, was VP of corporate marketing of a huge company. So I bought lots of ads. I bought the biggest ad Wall Street Journal ever sold. It was I forget, 20 pages long. But then I became publisher of InfoWorld. I learned how to sell ads, which is a wonderful thing.
And at this time, were you doing anything else? Was this part of like an experimental transition, or did you went whole hog into the publishing world right from there?
I whole hog became CEO and publisher of InfoWorld, and I took us from $50 million a year to $100 million a year in advertising revenue.
What lessons? It seems like two very different businesses. So what lessons about companies and growth and leading an organization carried forward, and like what have you come to believe are kind of universal things for leading an organization like these companies that are very large organizations, whether it's 10,000 employees or 1,000 or 150?
I'm sure each person gets their own lessons from what they do. So I spent 13 years working on the 3Com project. And if I learned one thing there, it was the importance of sales. I became head of sales and succeeded at it. And then marketing. I had to learn the difference between sales and marketing. At the beginning, I didn't know the difference.
What is the difference?
Well, salespeople are generally on commission, and they get their tools from marketing. Marketing identifies promising customers and provides tools and manages communications like advertising and PR. But the salespeople are generally on commission, and they're hunter-killers, and they go out and get orders and drag them in. So marketing people are more like engineers. They're sort of like the engineering version of people. But they're generally not on commission. They're generally like engineers.
They're doing the research on the customers, trying to come up with messages for what's going to work.
They set quotas for the sales force. We ask them to produce data so there's friction between sales and marketing. Adversarial relationship, so how you manage that's very important. You can't let either side win exactly. But toward the end of the year, there's a big argument breaks out as marketing starts setting the quota for next year, and sales wants the quota to be low. and marketing has to argue why their quotas are higher than what they would like. Anyway, sales is important, and the important part of sales is communication, and the important part of communication is listening. So I go boom, boom, boom. Sales, communication, listening. I am the world's best listener.
To come full circle back to this, to put your educator hat back on and to bring this huge set of experiences that you've had from being in the bowels of the creation of the internet's most basic technologies up to running a technology publisher that's now at this point in the post-internet era in the late 90s, and 2000s. What are you teaching, or what are you what are you mentoring people today? And do you ever feel like there's things about the modern world that have outrun your experience? I mean, you're an older gentleman in the tech. You're a graybeard of tech. Is there a new tech that's outrunning you, Bob, or is it?
Definitely is. I mean, for example, the direct selling approach. A lot of sales is online now, and that's new. Social media is new. Journalism has lost its financial model, so journalism is in complete chaos. It was when I was doing PR, I headed PR at my company. I got to meet all the editors, and I understood the separation of church and state, and who the publishers were, and who the editors were, and who the reporters were, and what you did at a press conference and what you did. They don't have press conferences anymore, as far as I can tell. So a lot of that has changed. So I can't really give specific advice. In fact, I often begin when I'm asked to mentor. I say, "What I know was true there then, but this is here now, and so the advice I give you is not likely to be right on, so you should meet with some other people too." And then it's your job to integrate all the advice you get from all of us and decide what you're going to do. So I've stopped focusing on students, and I focus on faculty. And I think it's because I concluded 5 years ago that students, as a general rule, shouldn't start companies. They don't know anything. And to start a company, you need to know something. Of course, the students then say, yeah, but Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Michael Dell and Zuckerberg, they all dropped out of college to start companies. And then I say, name 5 more. And they can't. These are 5 or 6 or 7 very extreme exceptions to the rule. So you should start a company when you know something. So therefore, join somebody else's startup or go work for Xerox like I did, but don't think you're going to be the prime mover on a startup. Now, they hate this, but it's the best advice I can give them. So I focus on faculty. Faculty know stuff. They've been working on their technologies for some years. Most of them are not interested in starting companies. So we have 3,000 faculty members. I'm talking to 100 of them now. Only 100 out of 3,000 to see if is there a startup there, and do they want to do the work to get it started. I don't want them to run the startup generally.
Pretty close to when we first started to get to know each other, I had reached out because we were producing an unlikely thing for us to do, which was an event called Deprogram during South by Southwest a couple years back, which was like a kind of little like tech conference inside of the conference. We had the Charles Koch Foundation was one of our sponsors because Brian Hooks, who now runs the organization, had just started running it and reached out to me because we know each other for a long time and said, we really want to make more contact with folks in tech, and you guys are down there, and do you think you could help? And I was like, I don't know why you think I can help, but I will try. And so I thought, I met Bob Metcalf. He invented the whole internet, so he'd be a great person to come on. And I know Will Hurley, and maybe they can spar. They seem to be like the odd couple of Austin tech folks. And so you guys had a debate about the role of universities and university research institutions in, I guess you could kind of say, like the institutions of innovation. And Worley, I don't think, he certainly didn't graduate college. I'm not even sure if he technically graduated high school. I'm trying to remember our conversation. Worley was taking the position of, no, you don't need a college degree. You can go out and do it. And you took the opposite side. So make the case for the role of universities in sort of in the core institutions of innovation.
I'm assuming starting a company is our model of innovation.
I don't think we even have to think about it in those terms. I mean, that's obviously important
to make an
part
innovation,
of it,
to make an innovation, or in particular to start a company to make an innovation, you got to know something. And universities are a good place to learn something, but they're not the only places to learn something. You can, like Worley went to work for Apple and IBM and learned a lot of stuff while he was there. He didn't have to go to college, apparently. Michael Dell, obviously, and Bill Gates didn't need to go to college. It's funny how Harvard pretends to have taught Bill Gates anything, or how UT. What did we teach Michael Dell? He wasn't even here a year at UT, but he's an alumnus now of UT. So you don't have to go to college to know stuff, but you have to know stuff. Innovation isn't just having an idea. My daughter, when she was 8 years old, invented the idea of having GPS in a car. Well, she is in no position to implement that idea, and other people went on to do it, and she didn't get any credit for it. She just sat there and said, "Dad, you should have a GPS in your car." What a great idea, Julia. So just having ideas is not nearly enough. You need to know something, and it needs to be a valuable something that you know, and you need to know it better than anybody else around, and then you can do scale innovation. Now, there's lots of day-to-day innovation that doesn't require all that. Companies engaging with their customers do a lot of innovations day-to-day. You know, the release 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0 of their products, the year-to-year models of new cars, they have innovations in them. They're just not huge. Like Tesla is a huge step from the cars that went before it. But most of the cars that went before it were incremental innovations as opposed to a big one like the Tesla was.
I'm in the middle of reading Jonathan Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind, and it is trying to get at the rise of this sort of safe space mentality among college students in particular, but not exclusively college students. He really sort of identifies that there's a whole, like the generation, they call them iGen or Generation Z, kids born after 95. They feel a need to be coddled or protected from ideas that challenge them. Have you experienced any of this on campus at UT? Does it have any impact on your university experience? This sort of I don't know what to describe it exactly. It's a kind of anti-enlightenment mentality in a way. Maybe it's more in the humanities and political science and the social sciences than in the areas of school that you're engaged with. Do you have a sense of that movement that's taking place?
No, I don't think. I think I have too special a place to really know what's going on. I mean, I'm tenured and I'm old, and I have a National Medal of Technology, and I invented something, and I weigh 245 pounds, so no one messes with me. But I think there's a lot of messing going on now, and I don't like it much. I think the closest I get to it is shunning. I get a certain amount of shunning because I'm one of the few right-wing people there are at the University of Texas, one of the very few. And I think there's shunning going on, but I don't really. But I'm a special case. I don't know what it's like for, your ordinary schlemiel assistant professor who just, bushy-tailed, bright-eyed, and what happens to them, I don't know.
Yeah, so as we wrap up, let's talk about like personal philosophy a little bit. So, I'm not big into talking about just electoral politics in this podcast, but I am big into talking about philosophy, and we've touched a little bit on our shared admiration for capitalism. But you call yourself like a right winger. Where did you what? How do you expand that out a little bit? Like, how do you think of yourself philosophically? You're vocal politically on in the public sphere. So. Where do your ideas come from? What's kind of your motivator for the way you think about how the world should work?
Well, my parents believed in the American dream, and as far as I can see, they succeeded at it. When I received the National Medal of Technology, the great thing about it was it happened soon enough that my parents could go to the White House with me, and I remember putting my medal around my mother's neck, and it was the culmination of the American dream. So I think it started there in Brooklyn in 1946. I read Atlas Shrugged in 1959 as an 8th grader. And I've read it 5 times since. So Atlas Shrugged is my book. So my philosophy, and I've been in love with Dagny Taggart for a very long time.
You're not alone on that one.
And Silicon Valley is no, the Silicon Valley that I prospered and enjoyed in the 80s and 90s was as close as you could come to this economic freedom, American dream thing. So being in Silicon Valley reinforced the admiration for the American dream and free enterprise associated with it. And I'm a rabid anti-communist because I've just seen too many people die to put up with that bullshit. And oddly, there are 2 great movies out. Where's My Cohen, McCarthy's lawyer? I'm forgetting his first name. Anyway, there's a movie out on Cohen and there's a movie out on Stone. And they're very similar movies, The Evil Lawyers. And who was it?
Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn.
So
I was thinking Gary Roy. The
title of the movie is Where's My Roy Cohn? And you know who said that? President Trump said it when he realized he had made a mistake with his attorney general. And he said, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" Enforcer, thug. And now the Roger Stone movie comes out, and it's like a copy of the Roy Cohn movie because it's about a highly manipulative, obnoxious lawyer. You got to see these 2 movies. Anyway, it's part of my grandmother fought organized crime, many of whom were Italian, I might add, on the waterfront.
Of course, I'm always going to...
Waterfront of New York, at the Waterfront Commission of New York.
My grandfather used to say, there's only one group where it's okay to beat up on them in America today. It's Catholics. You can say something mean about anybody, and if you can't say anything about anybody, but you can beat up on Catholics. And I think you still can kind of beat up on Italians for being part of the mafia. And it's I'm not prepared to pull my victim card, but
Well, I was Catholic till I was 11, an Irish Catholic. And where I lived in Brooklyn, in Bay Ridge, the Italians and the Irish were completely mixed. And you walk down the street, and you could tell the Italian houses because they had a Madonna in the front yard, but the Irish ones didn't. So you could say, that was an Irish Catholic. I'm a converted Catholic. My Irish grandmother died, and my Norwegian grandmother took over. So I became Lutheran at the age of 11, just like that. And then I went to MIT eventually, which changed everything.
I made this film with Arthur Brooks, and we spent some time in Denmark, because of course Denmark is put up in the imaginations of some people in America, as being like this utopia of democratic socialism or whatever. And we went to a library where all the folks were gathering to sing religious hymnals in this sort of secular context. It was just a kind of secular mass. And Arthur asks the organizer, so people come and they're singing these songs about God, and they're here in the library. Do they go to church anymore? It's like, oh, no, we just go to the library. And when we came out, Arthur said, this is an example of what happens when you have the marriage of church and state. It's when you need a free market in religion, man, or it just dies on the vine. And I thought that was pretty interesting, because I think it still might be the state religion of many of the Nordic countries. They have like
I'm Norwegian,
state religions.
and we don't like Danes or Swedes. I don't remember why, but I know my grandmother didn't like them. But we were, Lutherans. I mean, all Norwegians are Lutherans, or they used to be anyway.
Do you have any parting words for people who are trying to chart a course for themselves and see themselves as an entrepreneur or an innovator, or somebody who wants to become an entrepreneur? What is your advice for somebody who has an idea, they know something? Where's the right place to start? They don't have any money. They don't necessarily have any money, but they know things, they've got skills, and they have an idea, and it looks promising. What's your advice for them?
Well, being an entrepreneur is a very high calling. It's although it's sometimes attacked, are some of our most famous entrepreneurs. As soon as you become a famous entrepreneur, people, Marxists in particular, attack you for being rich, because a lot of entrepreneurs get to be successful ones get to be rich. You shouldn't put up with that. It's a very high calling, and innovating advances the human condition. And so, yeah, if you're thinking of being an entrepreneur, do it now, immediately. And the place to start, as you asked, is with customers. You need to surround yourself with people who want. If you have ideas about innovation, you need to find customers for. Well, first you have to convince yourself. Then you have to convince co-founders, because starting a company is too hard to do by yourself. And then you got to start finding customers. And if you find customers, then you'll find, if you need investors, you may not. But if you do, they come after customers. Investors will invest in people who have customers. So you need to start with customers and convince them that, check with them that they may want what your innovation is going to be.
And on the philosophical side, for someone who is in this Generation Z and they've come up and their sense of capitalism is colored by the Great Recession and bank bailouts, and they see young bright-eyed, fresh-faced politicians talking about democratic socialism in your least grumpy way, what is your advice for them to try to on how to think about the world and how to think about business and capitalism?
Freedom and prosperity, those are the goals, and innovation is the engine that links them. That is, innovation converts freedom into prosperity and prosperity into freedom. That is true. The thing that's just infuriating about life is there are so many bad ideas that are attractive when initially presented. So you got to be careful to not take the early attractiveness of an idea as your position, because a lot of them don't play out well, like communism killed 100 million people last century. When it played out, it sounded good, I suppose. And when they took the Tsar into the basement and shot him, I guess sounded like a good idea, but it led to 100 million deaths thereafter. So, and I just quit Twitter. 10 years, 35,000 tweets, 25,000 followers. And I just stopped 2-3 weeks ago. Since then, I've begun reading books again. I had stopped reading books because I was tweeting. I mention that in passing only as a current event because I've gone cold turkey on it. And it's like, I suppose it's like breaking a really bad habit, which I now don't tweet 15 times a day like I used to. But one of the reasons that I punted on Twitter is I saw it as a place where bad ideas propagated in a way that I found unhealthy. There was something unhealthy going on there. We're in the sorting out of ideas, and the sorting out was not going well. It was not, even my own tweets annoyed me from time to time. There was something really unhealthy, toxic about the rhetoric and the discourse on Twitter. So just generalizing, I think it's to be a critical thinker and not to be seduced by attractive ideas that come by. I mean, this AOC lady, she's pretty, but she's peddling poison, and I'm sorry, that's how I feel about it. And I know it's poison because I've been around long enough to see those ideas in action.
So take a deep breath. Probably get off of the social media hamster wheel and give ideas a chance to play out. Ask what next and then what.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Bob. It's been a pleasure having this conversation with you.
Well, flattered by the opportunity to opine.
And opine you did, my friend.
Yes, it's a really high compliment when you ask someone for their opinion.
All right, well, we'll have to have you back again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Emergent Order podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting app. If you're interested in being a guest, shoot us an email at podcast@emergentorder.com. Our producer is Jesse Bennett.
Thanks again, and speak to you next time.